Poisoning the Nest by Natalie Muller. The Age of Heroes. In the ancient times, before the gods withdrew from the earth and left humanity to fend for itself, there was the Age of Heroes. For though the world had been purged of the Titans' monsters, the realm of man was not at peace. Brother fought brother, and rivalries among the great houses of Greece threatened to plunge the world into chaos. His brother and sister gods pressed Zeus to provide a worthy challenge for their offspring, a challenge that would place their children among the immortals, for the sons and daughters of gods should not be condemned to a mere mortal life. It was at this time that Gaia, the earth herself, cried out to Zeus, her miraculous grandson, pleading with him to relieve her of the burden of so many men who scampered across her surface. At once Zeus saw the answer, a solution that would satisfy all those who came begging at his throne, clutching his knees and grasping his chin. A war. Not just any war, but the greatest, fiercest, longest war the world had ever known. It would be a war to end all wars, a war which would grant immortality to its combatants, ranking them alongside the great monster slayers of old, Theseus, Perseus, Jason, and of course Heracles. And the greatest of those heroes that the war would produce, the man whose name would become synonymous with this war, would be the red-headed son of Theseus, a man whose life shall culminate in a great pursuit, one which will be spoken of over 100 generations from now. He knows as he runs that his actions will seal his fate, and yet he presses on, running down the man whose death will cause his own. He is Achilles. Death in battle will make him immortal. He is a man running, a man so caked in dust he looks like a statue. He is an armed man running. His arms and legs ache with fatigue, yet he cannot stop. He can feel the sweat running down his face, bleeding tracks of living colour back into it as the dust turns to mud. He cannot stop. On his heels, another man, clad as he is, pursues him. His chest is burning. Every breath he takes is painful. Above him tower the walls of the city around which he runs. 3 times he will run around these walls before he halts his flight. He is man-killing Hector, and today his fate will be decided. It was one of those clear, crisp mountain days where winter seems to have placed itself on hold for a few hours, granting a brief reprieve to the inhabitants of the town clinging to the ridges overlooking the valleys. At this time of year, the cloudless sky looked cobalt blue above the sapphire mountains and valleys. It was a day for activity as gardeners, taking advantage of the mild conditions, pruned fruit trees and ornamentals. The century-old custom of imposing gardens of European favourites on the thin, fragile soils of the sandstone ridges, first begun when homesick colonists and convicts alike stepped off their ships in Sydney Harbour. Another blue jewel in this unfamiliar land. Here the mountain ridges bore the brunt of the southerly winds, causing the wanton eucalypts to dance a wild jig, but tearing down far more staid oaks and pines. Today there was no wind. Today the gardener's waste material ascended to the heavens in orderly columns, while slow combustion stoves fueled by local eucalypts perfumed the air so that one at once recognized the smell of home and warmth. The man wasn't sure what had brought him to this exact spot. It was not the most convenient spot for what he had in mind, not with all the sightseers flocking around the viewing platform like a noisy gaggle of geese, pointing and exclaiming, some holding guidebooks, trying to name the cliffs which rose from the valley floor like ridges along a dragon's backbone. Women in white dresses clung to the rope at the edge as they looked down to the valley floor, invisible beneath the thick canopy of eucalypts, coachwood, and sassafras. Sitting down on a bench, the man placed both his hands over the handle of his walking stick. Leaning forward, he rested his forehead against his hands, closing his eyes. Perhaps, if he wished hard enough, they would all go away. He was too old to believe in wishes any more. He felt so old, like he had lived more lifetimes than he could count, yet at the same time it had not been enough. The same way one can sleep for 8 or 9 hours and still wake up feeling exhausted. Hell, He would be thankful for 3 or 4 hours of uninterrupted sleep. Raising his head, he rested his chin against his hands, watching the tourist walk to and fro. "Mummy, that man is crying." Turning to look, the man saw a small boy, having broken away from the crowd gazing at the view. He stood staring at the man as if he were far more interesting a sight than the mountains that the boy had in fact come to see. Turning away, the man swiped at the tears with the back of his hand. Helpless to stop their flow, he squared his jaw and stared back at the boy, making further ineffectual swipes at his face. Until the boy had seen him, he hadn't even noticed that he was crying. Things like this happened all too often these days. "George, come here, leave that poor man alone," called one of the women standing by the edge. The boy turned his head towards the voice with a look of irritation, and acknowledging that it was his mother who had spoken to him, but remained fixed to the spot. "George, don't make me come over there." Hearing this too common threat, the boy turned and ran back to his mother. The man watched, returning the child's gaze as he twisted his head round to watch the crying man. The man once again attempted to dry his face before accepting the futility of such action, resting his forehead against his hands, watching as big salty tears dripped from his nose and splashed onto the dry sand between his feet. As the afternoon drew to a close, the constant stream of sightseers dwindled, and the warmth of the day died, bringing with it hardness as the temperature dropped rapidly. With no cloud cover, the temperature would fall below freezing tonight, and tomorrow morning would wake to a thick layer of frost. The man shivered in his coat as he watched the sun disappear behind Narrowneck. Already the moon shone in the darkening sky. Alone now, the man rose from the bench he had occupied all afternoon. His movements were slow and uncertain. He leant on his walking stick, dragging his left leg, which had grown stiff and sore with cold and hours seated in the same position. As he made his way across the viewing platform to the rope strung above the drop, the 24 steps from bench to edge had exhausted him. He leant against the ropes, looking over into the gathering gloom which hid the forest from sight. This was it, the end. He had travelled this far and would go no further. He had walked these forests as a boy, not so many years ago, though it felt like centuries. It was fitting that he should return to them. Here he should find the peace which no green and pleasant countryside had given him. Behind him he heard the sound of a cab roaring down the road, the wheels scattered gravel as the driver brought the car to a sudden halt. Mustering all his energy, the man swung his left leg over the rope. He paused a moment, gathering his strength, one leg planted on the ground, the other dangling over the valley floor, waiting. "Jack!" Well, thank you. You have just heard the introduction to Natalie Muller's Poisoning the Nest. So, we will be back with our usual scheduled programming next week. I believe that Her Infernal Majesty has another play that she'd like to talk about. So, until then, pop along to the Black Cockie Press website, have a look, like, subscribe if you want to support us, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.